The next part of my Christmas candle ring project are the little miniature pine cones. We're going to be working with the continuous loop and continuous wraparound loop techniques. For the beads, we're going to be working with the same white mix that I used for the pine needles in my last video. And then for the brown, I'm using a hex cut bead that's an opaque iris bronze, so it's like a metallic bronze. The beads are a little bit more cylindrical in shape, and then they have facets cut in the side that just make them extra sparkly. Mine are a Matsuno brand, but you can, I'm pretty sure other brands make a hex bead that in a similar color that you could easily substitute. And they're all size 11 seed beads. And then for the wire, we need a 24 gauge brown copper core wire. And then of course you'll need a ruler and your handy little wire cutters. Now I have 2 bead spinners, so I'm going to use 2 bead spinners. If you've only got the one, I will recommend that you put your brown beads in the bead spinner. And then the white beads, you can either put them in a cup and scoop them out like I showed in the last video, or you can just put them on your bead mat because we're only going to be picking up about 8 of those at a time. For scale layer A, we're going to be working with the continuous loop technique, which is the same technique that we used in our pine needles. But I want my little white markings to show up in a very specific spot rather than random. So I'm going to pre-string my beads onto my wire. I'm going to start with 7 of my brown beads, and then 5 white beads. And then I need 7 to finish this loop, and then 7 to start the next one. So I'm going to string 14 of my brown beads, and then 5 of my white, and another 14 brown beads. And we're going to continue until we have enough for 4 loops. And after the 4th white segment, I just need 7 of the brown beads to complete that loop. So when you're finished stringing your beads, you'll have something that looks like this. And I've still got my wire attached to the spool. I didn't cut it off at all, just left it attached. Now we're going to be working with continuous loops again. That means that we need to leave a starting tail wire just like we did for the pine needles. But for the pine cone, it needs to be a little bit longer. We're going to leave about 5 inches there in front of our first loop. It's going to pinch and hold about right there. And then we need 19 beads total for the loop, but because I have the shading pattern, I know I need 7 brown beads on the far side of the white. So I just count out 7 of the brown beads right there, and that gives me my loop length. And we're going to fold that in half and make that into a loop. Squeeze it tight. 1, 2, 3, 4. And for this first loop, we're actually going to twist down a little bit further. We want about, that's too long. Let me undo a couple of those there. We want about 1/4 inch length of twisted wire right below that first loop. That will make that loop stick out a little bit further than the others in our finished unit. And then we're going to make 3 more loops that are normal, that just have the short stems, the short regular stems. So I'm going to count out my 19 beads, and then I'm going to leave a small little wire gap right in front of my beads. Fold it in half, squeeze it shut, and then twist 2, 3, 4, 2 full rotations right there. And we need 2 more just like that. And when I'm done, I can cut a slightly different length for my ending tail wire. So I'm not going to cut it exactly the same length as the starting, but just a little bit different. All right, so my finished scale unit A, or scale layer A, should look something like this. We're going to close this into a little circle so that these 3 shorter loops kind of wrap in a circle around this one with the taller tail. So we're going to kind of move that first one into the center so that the other ones surround it. And then we're going to twist these 2 bottom tail wires together just a couple of times just to secure the unit in place. I'm going to go through here and reshape these because they got a little bit mangled while I was doing that. So make sure that they are nice and straight. And then my finished scale layer A will look like this. Now, if you're making the candle ring project, you need to make 6 of these. If you're making just one pick that has one pine cone, you only need to make 1. To make scale layer B, we're going to be working with a technique called the continuous wraparound loop. And we do need to cut wire off of the spool. So we're going to cut for layer B, we need about 20 inches-ish of wire to cut off the spool. Now in French beading, the amount of wire used kind of depends a little bit on the person. Depending on your personal technique, you might use a little bit more, a little bit less wire than the designer. So always cut just a little bit extra so you have some wiggle room. Well, we're going to start with this brown color. So I'm going to string about a little over an inch there of my brown beads. All right, now this is a continuous technique, so we're going to be making all of the scales on one length of wire. It also means that we need to leave a starting tail wire. Now, unlike the pine needles, we do need a longer starting tail wire for the little pine cones. So about 5 inches there in front of the first loop. And then we need to count out 11 beads, which is what we're going to be using for our starting loop. And we're going to make this kind of the same way that we did the continuous loop. Fold that in half, pinch it closed because we don't want a gap in the middle of our scale. And then we're going to twist it just one full rotation. We don't want a very long twisted wire stem below the starting loop for wraparound loops. So there's the starting loop there. And then we need 5 of these brown beads to start the second row. And then I'm going to string somewhere between 7 and 9 of the white beads. I'm just going to use 8 for this demo, but all of mine were a little bit different. And then I'm going to string a bunch of these brown beads, enough to finish out the second row, make the starting loop for the second scale, and then start the second row of the second scale. So I'm just going to string a bunch now so I don't have to keep going back and forth to my bead spinner. We're going to push all of those down right below that starting loop. And we're going to keep tension on our beads just by kind of pushing down on the beads because we don't want any gaps forming where we're going to have exposed wire. So push down on the beads, and I'm going to grab my starting loop kind of between my thumb and forefinger. This is going to create a little channel where I can wrap the second row of beads around that starting loop, and I can pull and tug to make sure that that second row of beads is nice and tight and snug against the starting loop. And then also it won't go over or kind of bunch up on top of the starting loop. So doing this creates a little channel, and then I can just rotate my starting loop. And row 2 will fit right around the outside of that starting loop. Now you do want it nice and snug. We don't want gaps in the row, so make sure that you are pulling it tightly on this row of beads so that it fits directly beside the starting loop. Now we're going to make sure that this bottom wire sticking out, that's the starting tail wire, is nice and straight. And then measure the beads so that you kind of reach that bottom wire without going past it. And we're going to go over the front of that bottom wire. Always go over the front, and then double wrap that working wire right there below that last row of beads. It'll look like a little coil of wire right there below. And that finishes off the first scale. And we need 4 of those for layer B. So I'm going to count out another 11 beads to make the starting loop for my second little scale. Now we need to leave a space of wire here in the front, and it needs to be long enough that we can make the starting loop and then also wrap row 2 and then have a tiny little bit of space left over to kind of space out our little scales so they aren't too close together. So I'm going to leave about this much space. That's about 1/4 of an inch. You can actually measure by making it the same length as the bottom wire on your first little scale. So if you need to measure that, you can. It might be a little bit different for everybody, but there's only 2 rows, shouldn't be that different here. So about 1/4 of an inch there should be enough space. I'm going to pinch and hold that spacing because I don't want it to shrink and I also don't want it to grow. And then we're going to make the starting loop for the second scale. Pinch that closed and then 1 full rotation. So it'll look like that. And then we're going to start row 2 with 5 of these brown beads. If you have any excess, just pull them off and put them back in your bead spinner. And then we need somewhere around 7, 8, or 9 white beads. And then I'm going to string enough brown beads to finish this one and start the next scale. So just a couple inches of my brown there. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to push down on my beads to make sure I don't have any wire gaps forming between the beads. And I'm going to grab and rotate that starting loop while wrapping the second row tightly around the outside. I'm going to make sure that my bottom wire is kind of pulled at a 90-degree from the first one. That just helps me to make sure that that little bottom wire for the second scale is nice and straight. Take a minute to mold your rows if you need to. Measure out to the bottom wire, and again we're going to wrap over the front and around the back twice in a little coil right there below the last row of beads. And notice I've got this tiny little bit of space left over between, which is exactly what you want. And I've already got brown beads on my wire, so I can continue. I need to make 2 more just like it. So I'm going to leave a tiny space, hold the space, make my starting loop. That doesn't look right. I'm 1 bead short there. Okay. Make my starting loop, 1 full rotation, 5 beads to start row 2, and then 7 to 8 or so of these white beads, and then enough brown to finish this one and start the next one. Now to make sure my beads fall off when I've strung, I just kind of pinch and hold like this with my pinky, but you can make a little loop in the end of your wire if you have trouble holding your beads like that. Okay, so again, I'm going to wrap row 2 around the outside, and my little starting loop here has a little bit of a gap in it, so I'm going to try and pinch that a little bit closer. It's a little bit hard with these cylinder beads. There's a little bead right here at the top that kind of makes it hard to get it pinched really close there, so make sure you've got no gap there, no hole in the middle of your scale. And then wrap row 2 around the outside. Again, I'm going to give a nice little tug on my wire as I'm wrapping around to make sure that my row 2 is nice and snug around the starting loop, and then double wrap. Now I'm going to intentionally leave too much space here so I can show you how to handle it if you do have too much of a gap left over between your scales. So I'm going to do this incorrectly. Alright, so let's say I've finished my last scale here, and I've realized that I've left way too much space between that 3rd and 4th scale. We can fix this. It's generally better if you just try to have proper spacing in the first place, but if you do accidentally slip and leave too much space, you can take this little length of wire that's too long, the little length of wire between the scales, and then wrap it around the bottom of the previous scale. That should help shorten it. So I'm going to pull this out to make sure that I have a nice clear path there, and then wrap that wire again around the bottom of the previous scale, and that will help me to fix my spacing. Now it's always better to just practice your spacing to begin with. That'll help improve your technique. Alright, so scale layer B is going to look like this once you've finished making all of your little loops. Now there is a front side and a back side to these components. The front side, you should not see any wire wraps here below the starting loop except for the tie-off. You're going to see that one, but that's not going to be visible in the finished component. If you flip over and look at the back, you're going to see this little wrap here right below the starting loop where you wrapped around the back side without beads covering it. Okay, so that's going to be the back side of your component, and the front side should look like this without any wires exposed right here. If you do have wires exposed here, then either your rows are not tight enough together, so you've got that wire exposed below the starting loop, or you did not measure enough beads to fit the row. You might have shorted yourself a bead and measured in front of the bottom wire instead of right on top of it. So when you remake your next component, make sure you've measured out your beads properly, because you should not have any wires showing on the front. Now we're going to twist these two tail wires together to kind of close the unit into a circle. We want there to be a little hole in the center of our component. You can see it right there, the little hole right in the middle, but we don't want it to be a very large hole. So I'm going to squeeze these tightly together so that I end up with a hole but a small one. And then I'm going to twist just a couple of times to secure the unit. Now, usually in a flower, you would have these stem wires coming out the bottom side, the same side as the back of your scales. But for this pine cone, we want the stem wire to come out the top. So it should be coming out, sticking up from the same way as the front of your components. Twist that a couple times there. That's not very secure. So just a couple times there. Now to shape these little scales, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my finger kind of right in the middle and push down with that finger while pushing out with my thumb. And that's going to give me a little curve there for my little pine cone scales. Alright, so a finished scale layer B will look like this. If you're making the candle ring, you need to make 6 of these. If you're making just a single pick, you need to make 1 of these. Now there will be 2 more scale layers that you'll make using the same technique as layer B. So layer C, let's look at this one. It's made exactly the same as layer B, but we just have 1 more scale. So you'll have 5 total scales instead of 4. We've got that same 11 bead starting loop, the same shading pattern for the second row, but you'll need about 24-ish inches to complete this unit. Now for unit C, we need to make more of these for the pine cones. You'll need to make 3 per pine cone. We've got 6 pine cones in the candle ring, so you need to make 18 of these if you are making the candle ring. If you're making 1 pick that has 1 pine cone, you just need to make 3. Now scale layer D is the last one, and it's made just like the previous ones, but we have 6 scales instead of 4 or 5. So we have that same 11 bead starting loop. We have the same shading pattern for the outer row. And you're going to need somewhere around 28-ish inches of wire to complete this component. Now we only need 1 of these in each pine cone, so if you're making the candle ring that has 6 pine cones, you need to make 6. If you're making the pick that just has 1 pine cone, then you just need 1 of layer D. Now let's talk about how to assemble the pine cones. Each pine cone should have 1 layer A, 1 layer B, 3 layer C, and 1 layer D. But they're going to be assembled in this order. Okay, so A, B, C, C, D, and then B. Now to start out, we're going to take layer A, make sure the bottom wires are straight, and we're going to insert it into the hole that's in the center of layer B. So both of these little stem wires need to go through the same hole right in the center of layer B, and we're going to push those together so that they sit right against each other. There's no space between them, so right against the bottom there. And then we're going to twist all 4 of these stem wires together just a couple of times just to secure this place. So just twist a couple times there. Now it might get a little bit mangled for now, that's fine. We can go back and reshape it a little bit later. Now again, I'm going to straighten out all 4 stem wires now, and I'm going to insert these into the center hole of a unit C. So there's a little hole right there in the middle. We need to get all of our stem wires through that same hole, and I find it's easier if you kind of pinch near the end like this. That kind of helps make all the little stem wires a little bit more together so they all go through. Right, so all the way through, and then again we're going to push that unit right against the bottom of the AB unit. Now you can play with spacing here if you want to stick it out a little bit further. You can make a little bit of a gap between unit B and unit C if you want to. It helps to like lengthen your pine cone. I am going to leave a tiny little bit of a gap, I think. So I've got a little bit of space there between, let me open this up so you can see, between my unit B and the C. I don't know if it's going to show. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a gap there just to create a little bit of spacing and make my pine cone a little bit longer and less squat looking. So I'm going to hold that spacing, and then again I'm going to twist a couple of times here. If you need to use pliers for this, please do. I don't want anybody hurting their hands, but I've got strong hands, so I'm just going to use those. Now again, we're going to straighten out all of these bottom wires. We're going to have 6 now that need to go into the hole. I'm going to use this one because that one's got a short wire. That's going to be a pain to get through all the little holes. Okay, so again, I'm going to squeeze all of my little wire ends together. Make sure that they're nice and straight so that that's easier to get through the hole. And then they all need to go through the center hole of the next layer C. And again, you can play with spacing. I am going to space mine just a little bit between the layers. And I'm also going to turn my unit so that the scales in the second layer C are kind of between the scales in the previous layer. If they sit directly on top of each other, it looks a little bit funny. So if I kind of alternate the layering a little bit, to me that looks a little bit better for a pine cone. Now I might change after I twist it though, so try and hold it, try and hold my spacing, and then I'm going to twist these components a couple times. Now again, I can fix the shaping when I'm done. Straighten out all my stem wires, and all 8 of these ones have to go in the center of my layer D. This is the one with the 6 little scales on it. I've got to get all the little tail wires to the same hole. And then again, I'm going to leave a little bit of a space. You can compact yours a little bit more if you want a shorter pine cone. So I'm going to leave a little tiny space there. I think it's somewhere between 1/4 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch that I'm using as spacing there, if I had to estimate that. Okay, so I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm going to twist again. Now again, you can use pliers. I'm just going to use my hands. Okay, and then I've got one last layer C. So straighten out all my wires, pinch them together, and I got to get them all through this hole. Pinch and squeeze near the end. I'll press all the little ends together and then get them all through. Oh, I got one that did not go through. 2 that did not go through. Okay. There we go, and we're going to pull that and sit that right down at the bottom of the pine cone. And again, I'm going to try and twist it so that the little scales are between the scales in the previous layer instead of right above them. And I'm going to give one final twist, and this time I'm going to twist down a little bit further to make the little stem of my pine cone. Now, I'm being very careful not to crush. I'm just trying to hold this in place, hold it steady without crushing it. But of course it does get a little bit mangled, so I'm going to go through and kind of reshape my pine cone a little bit. So I'm going to pull out my scales so they kind of flip out. Okay, the rest of them don't look too bad. Let's go up here to this one. I'm going to curl these outward a little bit. They got a little bit flattened. So I'm going to curl the tips out a little bit. And then these unit A, I'm going to spread them apart a little bit there. Alright, so there is my finished pine cone. Now if you are making the candle ring, you should have 6 of these. Don't like how these scales are lining up. Okay. Alright, that's a little bit better. Alright, so if you're making the candle ring, you should have 6 of these little pine cones. If you are making just the single pick, then you're just going to have 1 pine cone.